When I discovered my husband Derek's affair during our 5th anniversary dinner at the Meridian, I didn't cry or cause a scene. Instead, I called the number on his phone and invited Natasha's husband, Marcus, to join us at our table. Derek thought I was having a breakdown, but what happened next would teach him the true meaning of calculated devastation.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
By the time dessert arrived, I had signed documents that would strip him of everything he thought he owned, while the man whose wife had betrayed him became my most valuable ally in destroying the empire Derek believed he had built. The crystal chandelier cast perfect shadows across our reserved table at the Meridian, Denver's most exclusive restaurant, where Derek had proposed exactly 5 years ago. The irony wasn't lost on me as I watched my husband fidget with his phone while our anniversary dinner grew cold between us. Derek Hartwell had always been charming, the kind of man who could sell ice to penguins, but tonight his practiced smile flickered every time his phone buzzed. "Remember when we first came here?" he asked, gesturing around the elegant dining room. "You were so nervous about the prices on the menu." His laugh felt rehearsed, and his eyes kept drifting back to the device lying face down beside his bread plate. I remembered that night differently. I hadn't been nervous about the prices because I couldn't afford them. I'd been calculating whether this expensive dinner would be worth the networking opportunity Derek claimed it represented. Even then, I had been the one analyzing costs and benefits while he focused on appearances. His phone buzzed again, and this time he couldn't resist checking it immediately. Whatever he was seeing transformed his expression from forced anniversary joy to something that looked like anticipation mixed with guilt. "Work emergency?" I asked, though we both knew Hartwell Digital Solutions didn't have clients who generated genuine emergencies on Saturday evenings. "Just a client concern," Derek replied without looking up. "You know how it is. Success requires constant attention to detail." I did know how it was, though not in the way Derek assumed. I knew because I handled 90% of our actual client relationships, managed the data analytics that drove our campaigns, and maintained the systems that kept our agency profitable, while Derek focused on networking events that seemed to generate more Instagram posts than business results. When he excused himself to take a call, claiming the restaurant was too noisy, his phone remained on the table, still blowing with notifications. I had never violated Derek's privacy before, but something about tonight felt different. The constant texting, the distracted conversation, the way he kept checking his watch as if he had somewhere else he'd rather be. The phone unlocked automatically, revealing a text thread that made my breath catch. The contact was Natasha, creative, and the conversation stretched back months, chronicling an intimate relationship that existed parallel to our marriage. Messages about secret dinners, weekend getaways Derek had explained as solo networking retreats, and detailed discussions about future plans that seemed to exist in a universe where Elena Hartwell had been erased. But what struck me most wasn't the evidence of Derek's infidelity, it was the casual dismissal of my contributions. Natasha Chen, apparently creative director at Morrison & Associates, wrote about that clueless wife who has no idea what's really happening in her own company. Derek's responses revealed plans to gradually push me out of Hartwell Digital Solutions, positioning me as administrative support who had outlived her usefulness. The messages painted a systematic betrayal that extended far beyond adultery. This was corporate espionage dressed as romance, a coordinated effort to steal the business empire I had spent 5 years building, while Derek played charismatic frontman. Through the windows, I could see Derek pacing outside, gesticulating animatedly during his supposedly urgent business call. His body language suggested excitement rather than professional concern, and I realized he was probably talking to Natasha, coordinating whatever plans they had made for after our anniversary dinner. The phone buzzed with another message from her. "Can't wait to celebrate properly once you get rid of the dead weight. See you at the usual place in an hour." I scrolled through the contact list until I found Marcus Chen, who appeared frequently in recent call logs. According to the message history, Derek had been consulting with Natasha's husband about financial restructuring, though Marcus works as a forensic accountant. The irony was perfect. Derek had been using Natasha's husband's expertise to plan my elimination while carrying on an affair with the man's wife. I dialed Marcus Chen's number without hesitation. When a confused voice answered, I introduced myself with perfect composure.
Hello, Marcus. This is Elena Hartwell, Derek's wife. I'm calling because I think we need to have a conversation about our respective spouses. Are you available to join me for dinner at the Meridian downtown? I believe we have quite a lot to discuss, and I suspect you'll find the conversation as illuminating as I have. Marcus Chen arrived exactly 37 minutes after my call, his dark sedan pulling up with the quiet efficiency of someone accustomed to handling crisis situations. He emerged wearing a charcoal gray suit that suggested professional success without ostentation, his graying temples and measured movements reflecting someone who analyzed problems for a living. Derek was still outside conducting his supposed business call when Marcus entered the restaurant. I approached the hostess station where Marcus stood, scanning the dining room with analytical eyes that noticed details others might miss. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said, his handshake firm and direct. "I appreciate you calling me directly rather than allowing this situation to continue without all parties being aware of what's happening." I guided him to our table, noting how he automatically positioned himself to observe the entrance while maintaining clear sightlines to the windows where Derek continued his animated phone conversation. "Please, call me Elena," I said as we settled into our seats, "and thank you for coming so quickly. I suspect we're both going to learn things tonight that will change our understanding of our respective marriages quite dramatically." Derek's figure outside had shifted from excited gesticulation to something that looked more like concern. His body language suggested his phone call had taken an unexpected turn, and I wondered if Natasha had mentioned receiving a call from her husband asking pointed questions about her Saturday evening plans. Marcus studied the menu briefly before setting it aside, his attention focused entirely on our impending conversation. "Your call suggests that our spouses have been conducting more than just a professional relationship. I'm a forensic accountant, Mrs. Hartwell, so I tend to approach these situations by examining evidence rather than relying on assumptions." "That's exactly why I called you," I replied, retrieving Derek's phone from my purse. "I think you'll find the evidence quite comprehensive, and I suspect your professional expertise will help us both understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." I showed Marcus the text message thread between Derek and Natasha, watching his expression shift from professional detachment to something harder as he read through months of intimate communications. His jaw tightened when he reached messages about weekend getaways that Natasha had apparently described to her husband as solo retreats for creative inspiration. "How long have you suspected?" Marcus asked, his voice maintaining steady cadence despite what I assumed was significant emotional turmoil. "Until tonight, I didn't suspect anything," I admitted. "Derek has always been charming and confident, but he's also been increasingly distracted, spending more time on networking events that seem to generate more social media content than actual business results." Marcus scrolled through more of the conversation, his trained eye picking up patterns that confirmed the systematic nature of their deception. These messages reference financial discussions they've been having about business restructuring and asset protection. "Has Derek mentioned anything about changing your company's ownership structure?" The question struck me with the force of recognition. Derek had indeed mentioned conversations about corporate restructuring, describing them as routine business optimization that would improve our tax efficiency and legal protection. "He's been working with legal and financial advisors about restructuring Hartwell Digital Solutions," I said, understanding beginning to crystallize. He described it as routine business development, but now I'm wondering if those restructuring plans were designed to minimize my ownership stake while maximizing his control. Marcus nodded grimly, recognizing patterns that indicated financial manipulation. If Derek has been working to restructure your business ownership while conducting an affair with my wife, we're looking at a coordinated effort that goes far beyond simple marital infidelity. Through the windows, Derek had ended his call and was heading back toward the restaurant.
His expression carried frustration and concern that suggested his conversation hadn't gone according to plan. As he approached our table and noticed Marcus Chen, his face underwent a remarkable transformation, cycling through surprise, confusion, and growing panic.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
"Elena, darling," Derek said, his voice carrying forced joviality, "I see you've invited someone to join us. How wonderful to have company for our anniversary celebration." Marcus stood and extended his hand with professional courtesy that carried barely controlled tension. "Marcus Chen, I believe you've been working with my wife Natasha on some creative projects. Elena thought it would be interesting for us to meet and discuss our mutual connections." The handshake lasted several seconds longer than social convention required, with Derek clearly struggling to understand how his carefully compartmentalized deceptions had suddenly collided in Denver's most exclusive restaurant. "Marcus is a forensic accountant," I said, conversationally, watching Derek's reaction. "We've been having the most fascinating discussion about business partnerships and asset protection strategies. It turns out he has quite a lot of experience investigating situations where financial structures don't reflect the true nature of business relationships." Derek's smile became increasingly strained as he processed the implications of Marcus's profession and presence at our anniversary dinner. "How interesting," he managed. "I'm sure Marcus has seen all kinds of complex business situations." "Oh, absolutely," Marcus replied, his tone remaining professionally neutral while his eyes never left Derek's face. "Some of the most fascinating cases involve situations where people assume they can restructure assets and relationships without the other parties involved understanding what's really happening. Those cases rarely end well." I signaled the waiter for another wine glass, maintaining the gracious hostess persona while internally calculating the strategic advantages of having both men at the same table. Derek's discomfort was obvious, but Marcus's professional composure suggested he was someone who could be trusted with long-term planning that would be required to address the full scope of what we were facing. "Now that we're all here," I said, raising my wine glass in a toast that carried darker implications than its surface suggested, "perhaps we should discuss how we want to handle our newly complicated family dynamics." The silence following my toast stretched uncomfortably while Derek processed the implications of Marcus Chen's presence and professional expertise. I opened a leather portfolio Derek had never seen before, one I had assembled during late evening hours when he was supposedly working late at the office. "Before we discuss how to handle our current situation," I said, spreading documents across our table with deliberate precision, "I think it's important that everyone understands what exactly has been built during our marriage and who was responsible for building it." Derek's expression shifted from forced calm to genuine concern as I revealed financial records, client correspondence, campaign development notes, and strategic planning documents that chronicled the true development of our digital marketing agency. Every innovation Derek claimed as his entrepreneurial vision had been meticulously documented in my handwriting, with timestamps and email records that preceded his public presentations by weeks or months. "When Derek and I started Hartwell Digital Solutions 5 years ago," I explained to Marcus while maintaining eye contact with my husband, "we positioned him as the client-facing representative while I handled the technical and strategic components. Derek has natural talent for networking, which made him perfect for securing new business and maintaining client satisfaction." Marcus nodded, following the logic of such partnership arrangements. "That's common in professional service firms. Client development and technical delivery require different skill sets, so specialization often produces better results." "Exactly," I continued, selecting a thick folder labeled Campaign Development Chronological. The challenge arose when Derek began presenting our collaborative work as his individual innovations during industry conferences and investor meetings. What started as practical division of labor gradually evolved into public credit allocation that didn't reflect our actual contributions. Derek's face had gone pale as he recognized documents he had never seen before, records I had maintained throughout our marriage that demonstrated the true origins of every successful campaign our agency had delivered. The sustainable marketing strategies that earned industry recognition, the data analytics protocols that delivered superior ROI, the creative frameworks that distinguished our agency from larger competitors. Every system that made Hartwell Digital Solutions profitable had been developed through my expertise while Derek focused on networking activities. Elena, these documents, Derek started, his voice carrying desperation, are accurate, I finished. Marcus, as a forensic accountant, I'm sure you understand the importance of maintaining detailed documentation when ownership and contribution claims might become disputed.
Marcus examined the papers with professional interest, his trained eye recognizing the thoroughness of my documentation. These records would hold up in any legal proceeding involving intellectual property disputes or partnership dissolution. The email timestamps and development notes create a clear chain of evidence regarding who created what innovations when. Derek reached for his wine glass with trembling hands, his confident facade cracking under the weight of evidence he hadn't known existed. Elena, I never intended to minimize your contributions to our success. When I present our work publicly, I'm representing both of us as a team. Are you? I asked, retrieving another folder labeled Public Presentations, Credit Attribution. Because these transcripts from your conference speeches and investor meetings suggest that you consistently refer to my vision, my innovations, and my strategic framework rather than discussing our collaborative partnership. The folder contained printed transcripts of Derek's presentations at industry events, interviews with business publications, and quotes from marketing podcasts where he had systematically claimed ownership of work that originated entirely with my expertise. Reading through his public statements created a clear pattern of credit theft that had evolved from occasional oversights to deliberate misrepresentation. Marcus studied several pages before looking up at Derek with the expression of someone who had just identified significant financial irregularities. Mr. Hartwell, these presentation transcripts suggest that you've been claiming individual ownership of intellectual property that was developed through collaborative partnership. If your business was ever audited, this documentation could create serious problems regarding accurate representation of company assets. The intellectual property issue becomes particularly relevant, I continued, when we consider Derek's recent discussions about restructuring our company ownership to optimize tax efficiency and legal protection. Marcus, I assume your expertise would help us understand whether those restructuring plans were designed to benefit both partners equally or to concentrate control with one party. Derek's expression underwent a remarkable transformation as he realized that his financial planning discussions could be analyzed by someone with Marcus's professional background. The asset protection strategies he had been developing would be transparent to forensic investigation that examined the true origins of our company's value. I think, Marcus said carefully, that both Elena and I would benefit from understanding exactly what kinds of legal and financial advice Derek has been receiving about business restructuring, particularly if those consultations involve discussions about protecting assets in case of partnership dissolution. The waiter approached to refill wine glasses, providing a moment of normal social interaction that felt surreal given the intensity of our conversation. Derek managed to maintain his charming public persona long enough to assure the server that everything was excellent. Anniversary celebration? Marcus repeated after the waiter departed. How interesting that Derek chose your anniversary dinner as the occasion for conducting business calls with my wife about their future plans together. Derek's remaining composure finally cracked completely. How much do you know? He asked, his voice dropping to a whisper. Enough, I replied simply. Enough to understand that your affair with Natasha was coordinated with systematic efforts to eliminate me from our business partnership. Enough to recognize that your recent legal consultations were designed to protect assets from the wife you were planning to divorce rather than optimizing our joint financial position. And enough to realize that you've been using Marcus's professional expertise to plan my elimination while betraying his marriage. Marcus's expression had shifted to something much harder than professional detachment.
You consulted with me about asset protection while conducting an affair with my wife? It wasn't supposed to happen this way, Derek said desperately. The business discussions were separate from personal complications. I never intended for anyone to get hurt unnecessarily. Unnecessarily, I repeated, tasting the word like something bitter. As if there was a necessary amount of hurt involved in your plans to steal my business and abandon my marriage. Marcus gathered several of my documents and studied them with renewed focus. Elena, based on what I'm seeing here, you have comprehensive documentation that would support significant legal claims regarding intellectual property ownership and partnership equity. If Derek has been planning to restructure your business ownership while conducting an affair, you're looking at a situation that involves both corporate fraud and marital betrayal.
Which is exactly why I invited you to join us tonight, I said, meeting Derek's increasingly panicked gaze directly, because I suspect we're going to need professional expertise to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with, and I have a feeling that Derek's plans are about to become much more complicated than he anticipated. The transformation in Derek's demeanor was remarkable to witness. The confident businessman who had entered the Meridian 2 hours earlier had been replaced by someone beginning to understand that his carefully constructed deceptions were unraveling in ways he had never anticipated. His hands trembled as he reached for his wine glass, eyes darting between Marcus and me as if calculating escape routes. Marcus had shifted into full forensic mode, his analytical mind processing the implications of everything he had learned, connecting patterns that revealed a conspiracy far more sophisticated than simple marital infidelity. He gathered several of my documents and arranged them chronologically, creating a timeline that demonstrated Derek's systematic appropriation of my intellectual property alongside his romantic betrayal. Elena, Marcus said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone who had seen similar patterns in corporate fraud investigations, how long have you been maintaining these detailed records of your contributions to the business? Since the beginning, I replied. My father, William Thornton, taught me early in my career that documentation is the foundation of professional protection. He always said that in any partnership, the person who can prove their contributions is the person who maintains control of their destiny. Derek's expression flickered with recognition at my father's name. Bill Thornton was a legend in Denver's business community, a venture capitalist who had built his reputation by identifying genuine talent and supporting entrepreneurs who possessed both vision and execution capability. Derek had always been intimidated by my father's success and analytical nature, though he had hidden that insecurity behind practiced charm. Your father's advice was prescient, Marcus observed, studying my meticulous documentation with professional appreciation. Most business partnerships fail because the parties involved make assumptions about contribution and ownership without maintaining clear records of who actually created what value. I watched Derek's face as Marcus spoke, noting how his initial panic was evolving into desperate calculation. He was clearly trying to determine whether this situation could be managed through the charm and persuasion that had worked throughout his professional career, or whether he was facing consequences that couldn't be talked away. The timeline here is particularly interesting, Marcus continued, pointing to a series of documents that chronicled our agency's most successful campaigns. These development notes show Elena creating innovative strategies that Derek presented publicly months later, claiming them as his original ideas. In forensic accounting, we call this pattern systematic value extraction, and it's often a precursor to more serious financial crimes. Derek finally found his voice, though it carried none of its usual confidence. Marcus, I think you're misunderstanding the nature of our business partnership. Elena and I have always worked collaboratively, and when I present our work publicly, I'm representing both of us as a team. Are you? I asked, retrieving my phone and opening a video file I had recorded 3 weeks earlier. Because this footage from the Colorado Marketing Summit suggests otherwise. The video showed Derek delivering a keynote presentation to an audience of industry professionals, discussing innovative approaches to digital campaign optimization that he described as his personal breakthrough in understanding consumer psychology.
Every strategy he presented had originated with analysis I had conducted during late evening hours, when Derek was supposedly attending networking events that now seem likely to have been romantic meetings with Natasha Chen. Marcus watched the presentation with growing incredulity. He's claiming individual ownership of work that your documentation proves was developed through your expertise. If this pattern extends to patent applications or intellectual property registrations, Derek could be facing serious legal consequences beyond just partnership disputes. The mention of legal consequences seemed to complete Derek's psychological collapse. The charming entrepreneur who had built his reputation on borrowed innovations was confronting the reality that his entire professional identity might be based on foundations that belong to someone else.
Derek, I said, my voice carrying a calmness that seemed to unsettle him more than anger would have. I need you to understand something important. For 5 years, I've been building systems and creating innovations while allowing you to take public credit because I believed we were partners working toward shared goals. I trusted that your networking and client development activities were complementing my technical and strategic work to build something meaningful together. Derek nodded desperately, perhaps hoping that acknowledgement of our partnership might somehow mitigate the consequences of his systematic betrayal. Elena, that's exactly what we've been doing. We're a team, and everything we've built belongs to both of us equally. Does it? Marcus interjected, his tone carrying the skeptical edge of someone who had spent years investigating financial deception. Because the business restructuring consultations Derek has been conducting suggest that he's been working to concentrate ownership and control in his name while minimizing Elena's legal claims to company assets. The accusation hung in the air like a physical presence. Derek's face cycled through expressions that revealed his internal struggle between continued deception and acknowledgement of what we all knew to be true. The restructuring discussions were about tax optimization, Derek said weakly. Every growing business needs to evolve its legal and financial frameworks to maximize efficiency and protection. Marcus's expression suggested he had heard similar explanations from other subjects of forensic investigations. Tax optimization doesn't typically involve transferring intellectual property ownership or modifying partnership equity without the knowledge and consent of all parties involved. What you're describing sounds more like asset consolidation, designed to benefit one partner at the expense of another. I leaned back in my chair, observing the dynamic between the two men with detached fascination. Derek's carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time, while Marcus was applying professional expertise to dismantle deceptions that had taken months to establish. There's something else you both should know, I said, deciding that complete transparency would be more strategically valuable than gradual revelation. 3 weeks ago, I established Thornton & Associates, a digital marketing consultancy that will be launching officially next month. I've already secured commitments from several clients who were specifically interested in working with the person responsible for the innovations they had heard Derek present at industry conferences. Derek's remaining color drained from his face as he processed the implications of my announcement. Elena, you can't start a competing business while we're still partners in Hartwell Digital Solutions. That would violate our partnership agreement and create conflicts of interest that could destroy both companies. Could it? I asked, retrieving another folder from my portfolio. Because according to the partnership agreement we signed 5 years ago, either party can establish independent business ventures as long as they don't directly compete with existing client relationships or violate intellectual property protections. Marcus examined the partnership agreement with professional interest, his eyebrows rising as he identified clauses that Derek had apparently forgotten or misunderstood. This agreement actually provides Elena with significant protection for her independent business activities, particularly if she can demonstrate that her innovations originated with her expertise rather than collaborative partnership development. The realization was visible on Derek's face as he understood that the legal frameworks he had assumed would protect his interests actually provided me with pathways to independence he had never considered.
His betrayal had been built on fundamental misunderstandings about the legal and financial foundations of our partnership. Derek, I said gently, watching him struggle with the magnitude of his miscalculations, I think it's time we discuss what comes next, because the evening is far from over, and I suspect we have quite a lot more to discover about the true nature of our respective relationships. Derek's mention of what comes next triggered something in his memory, and his expression shifted to genuine fear. He reached for his wine glass with unsteady hands, clearly remembering conversations that had seemed insignificant but now carried ominous implications. "Elena," he said carefully, "when we established our business partnership 5 years ago, your father insisted on including some unusual clauses in our agreement. I remember thinking they were unnecessarily complex for a straightforward business relationship between spouses." Marcus looked up with renewed interest. "What kind of unusual clauses?"
I smiled, remembering my father's insistence on comprehensive legal protection despite Derek's charming assurances that such precautions were unnecessary. Bill Thornton had built his venture capital empire by preparing for scenarios that optimistic entrepreneurs preferred to ignore. My father has always believed that the best partnerships are built on clear legal frameworks rather than emotional assumptions, I explained. When Derek and I were establishing Hartwell Digital Solutions, Dad insisted on including provisions that would protect both parties if the partnership dissolved due to misconduct or breach of fiduciary duty. Derek's face had gone pale as he recalled the lengthy legal discussions that had preceded our business launch. At the time, he had viewed my father's comprehensive contract requirements as old-fashioned paranoia from someone who didn't understand modern business relationships. Specifically, I continued, retrieving another folder, our partnership agreement includes provisions for intellectual property ownership, asset distribution, and business continuity in cases where one partner attempts to defraud or systematically deceive the other. Marcus studied the relevant clauses with professional fascination. These provisions are remarkably comprehensive. If Derek has been conducting affairs while planning to restructure business ownership without your knowledge, these misconduct clauses would trigger significant financial consequences. The partnership agreement Derek had signed 5 years earlier included provisions that would transfer majority business ownership to the non-offending party in cases of proven fraud, adultery, or systematic breach of fiduciary duty. My father's experience had taught him that personal betrayal and professional misconduct often occurred simultaneously. There are also provisions regarding non-compete agreements and client relationship ownership, I added, watching Derek's expression grow increasingly desperate. If our partnership dissolves due to misconduct on your part, I retain exclusive rights to all client relationships, intellectual property, and business methodologies we developed during our collaboration. Derek's hands trembled as he reached for the partnership agreement, clearly hoping to find some escape clause, but my father's legal team had been thorough, creating a document that protected against exactly the kind of systematic betrayal Derek had been orchestrating. "Your father was remarkably prescient," Marcus observed. "These clauses would hold up in any legal proceeding, particularly with the kind of comprehensive documentation Elena has maintained." The irony was exquisite. Derek had spent months planning to eliminate me through legal restructuring, but the original partnership agreement included provisions that would transfer his ownership stake to me if his misconduct could be proven. "Derek, do you remember the conversation we had with Dad's attorney when these clauses were being drafted?" I asked. "You said that people who truly love and trust each other shouldn't need legal protection from betrayal because genuine partnerships are built on mutual respect." Derek nodded miserably, recalling his younger self's optimistic dismissal of legal precautions that now seemed prophetic. "I thought your father was being overly cautious about scenarios that would never apply to our relationship." Marcus was examining the misconduct clauses with growing appreciation. These provisions create a complete framework for addressing exactly the kind of coordinated personal and professional betrayal that Derek and your wife have been conducting. "There's something else you should both understand," I said, retrieving my phone and opening an audio recording app showing files dating back several months. Dad also advised me to document any suspicious conversations or behaviors that might become relevant if Derek's character ever became questionable. Derek's expression shifted to panic. Elena, you've been recording our private conversations. I've been protecting myself, I corrected. Just as Dad taught me to do when dealing with partners whose behavior suggests they might not have my best interests at heart. Marcus studied the recording files with professional interest. Audio documentation of planning conversations would provide crucial evidence in any legal proceeding involving misconduct clauses. The protective measures my father had insisted upon 5 years earlier were revealing themselves to be remarkably comprehensive and strategically sophisticated. Every safeguard Derek had dismissed as unnecessary legal paranoia was now positioned to protect me from exactly the kind of betrayal he had been orchestrating.
Derek, I said, watching him struggle with the realization that his supposedly clever planning had been anticipated and countered by legal frameworks he had never bothered to understand. I think you're beginning to understand that your future is going to be significantly different from what you and Natasha have been planning together. The silence following Marcus's ultimatum stretched across our table while Derek struggled to process that every aspect of his professional identity had been built on foundations belonging to someone else. His confident businessman persona had completely evaporated, replaced by someone beginning to understand that his ownership claims were based on systematic theft. Marcus had shifted into full investigative mode, applying his forensic accounting expertise to dissect the true nature of Hartwell Digital Solutions with surgical precision. The documents spread across our table told a story that contradicted every public presentation Derek had ever delivered about his entrepreneurial success. Alina, Marcus said with measured professionalism, these development timelines demonstrate something remarkable. Every innovation that Derek has claimed as his breakthrough thinking actually originated with work you documented months earlier. In forensic accounting, we call this pattern systematic intellectual property theft. I nodded, appreciating Marcus's professional validation of what I had suspected but been reluctant to acknowledge. The pattern became clear about 18 months ago when Derek started presenting campaign strategies at industry conferences that I had developed during late evening hours while he was supposedly attending networking events. Derek finally found his voice, though it carried none of his usual persuasive charm. Alina, you're mischaracterizing our collaborative relationship. When we develop campaigns together, the ideas emerge through our discussions and brainstorming sessions. Marcus examined several documents before responding with analytical precision. Actually, Derek, your public presentations consistently use first-person singular language when describing innovations that Alina's documentation proves were developed through her individual expertise. The evidence was overwhelming. My development journals chronicled every successful campaign strategy, complete with timestamps, email correspondence, and client feedback that preceded Derek's public presentations by substantial margins. The sustainable marketing approaches that earned industry recognition, the data analytics protocols that delivered superior ROI, the creative frameworks that distinguished our agency. Every system had been developed through my expertise while Derek focused on networking activities that now seemed likely to have been romantic meetings with Natasha. Let me show you something specific, I said, opening a tablet with a presentation Derek had never seen. This is the campaign development process for Morrison Industries, our largest client. The project that Derek described to Marketing Week magazine as his breakthrough understanding of behavioral psychology. The presentation contained screen recordings of my work developing the Morrison campaign, complete with timestamps showing me creating innovative targeting strategies at 2 a.m. on weeknights when Derek claimed to be attending late networking events. Every creative breakthrough he had claimed had been documented in real time. Marcus studied the recordings with professional fascination. Alina, this documentation would hold up in any intellectual property dispute. You have comprehensive proof that Derek has been claiming ownership of work developed entirely through your expertise. Derek's face had gone ashen. Alina, I never realized you were maintaining such detailed documentation of our collaborative work. You would have, I interrupted, noting how his confession revealed his true intentions, been more careful about stealing credit for work you couldn't have conceived yourself? Marcus had already identified patterns that extended far beyond simple credit theft, revealing a coordinated effort to transfer intellectual property through deception. Derek, the combination of intellectual property theft, unauthorized business restructuring discussions, and extramarital affairs creates a pattern that triggers significant legal consequences under your partnership agreement. There's something else you both should understand, I said, opening another file containing client correspondence Derek had never seen. 3 weeks ago, I began reaching out to our key clients to discuss their satisfaction with our campaign strategies and their interest in continuing relationships under new management structures. Derek's expression shifted to panic. Elena, you can't contact our clients about business changes without discussing those decisions with your business partner. Marcus examined the client correspondence with growing appreciation. Actually, Derek, these communications appear to be routine satisfaction surveys and relationship maintenance activities. The client responses had been overwhelmingly positive and strategically valuable. Morrison Industries had specifically requested that future campaigns be developed by the person responsible for their current success. 3 other major clients had expressed similar preferences for maintaining relationships with whoever had created the innovative strategies they attributed to our agency's reputation. The clients aren't just satisfied with our work, I explained to Derek's increasingly desperate expression. They're specifically interested in continuing relationships with the person they believe is responsible for creating the campaigns that made their marketing efforts successful. Derek stared at the client correspondence with growing comprehension that his professional future had been undermined by the same systematic approach I had used to document his intellectual property theft. Derek, I said, watching him struggle with the magnitude of his strategic miscalculations, I think you're beginning to understand that everything you believed you owned was actually built on foundations that belonged to someone else. The moment that transformed our dinner conversation into something decisive arrived when Derek's phone erupted with urgent notifications. The buzzing was insistent, suggesting someone was desperately trying to reach him despite the late hour. Derek glanced at the device with obvious reluctance, clearly recognizing that any interruption would likely worsen his situation. "Aren't you going to answer that?" Marcus asked with measured curiosity. Derek reached for the phone with trembling hands, his face cycling through dread and calculation as he read the incoming messages. Whatever he was seeing was clearly not providing the support he desperately needed. His complexion went from pale to gray as he scrolled through multiple urgent communications. "It's Natasha," he said finally, barely above a whisper. "She's asking why Marcus is asking her detailed questions about her weekend plans and business relationships. She wants to know if something has happened and whether she should be concerned about legal implications." Marcus's expression remained professionally neutral, though I detected slight satisfaction. I may have mentioned to Natasha that I was having dinner with a business colleague who had interesting questions about unauthorized consulting relationships and potential conflicts of interest. The psychological pressure was mounting exponentially. Derek was trapped with evidence of his systematic betrayal spread before him, while his lover was beginning to understand that their deception had been exposed to forensic analysis by someone with professional expertise to recognize financial fraud. Derek's phone buzzed again, and this time he couldn't hide his reaction. His face underwent a remarkable transformation, cycling through disbelief, panic, and genuine desperation. "What is it?" I asked, noting how his hands had begun trembling. "She says Morrison and Associates contacted her today about irregularities in our consulting agreement and potential violations of their intellectual property protections." Marcus leaned forward with renewed interest. "Morrison and Associates represents Elena's intellectual property interests, doesn't it?" I nodded, appreciating how quickly Marcus was connecting the dots. 3 weeks ago, I retained Morrison and Associates to review our business partnerships and ensure that my intellectual property rights were properly protected under existing legal frameworks. Derek stared at me with growing comprehension that his betrayal had triggered legal mechanisms he had never anticipated. "Elena, you've been planning this confrontation for weeks. The client outreach, the intellectual property review, the documentation. This entire evening was orchestrated to trap me. Was it? I asked, maintaining calm composure. Or did I simply document your systematic betrayal and protect myself from the consequences of trusting someone whose character proved fundamentally unreliable? The distinction was important. I hadn't orchestrated his affair or forced him to steal credit for my innovations. I had simply documented his choices and prepared legal protections that would activate when his misconduct became undeniable. Marcus was studying Derek's phone messages with professional fascination. Derek, it appears that Natasha is beginning to understand that her involvement in your business restructuring plans might expose her to legal consequences she hadn't anticipated. Corporate espionage charges, intellectual property theft, conspiracy to commit fraud.
The mention of criminal prosecution seemed to complete Derek's psychological collapse. His charming entrepreneur persona had been systematically dismantled, revealing someone whose entire professional identity had been built on criminal foundations. "Elena," Derek said desperately, "we can work through this situation reasonably. Our marriage, our business partnership, everything we've built together. It doesn't have to be destroyed by misunderstandings and legal complications." "Could it hurt both of us?" I asked, retrieving another document, because this analysis from Morrison and Associates suggests that the misconduct clauses would transfer your ownership stake to me while protecting my intellectual property rights. Derek's remaining hopes seemed to evaporate as he processed the legal analysis that confirmed his worst fears. The partnership agreement he had dismissed as unnecessary legal complexity contained provisions that would strip him of everything, while ensuring I retained control of the business empire I had actually built. "There's something else you should both know," I said, opening a final folder. "This morning, I received confirmation that Fortin & Associates has been selected as the exclusive digital marketing partner for the Colorado Small Business Development Corporation, a 3-year contract worth approximately $2 million annually." Derek's face went completely white. The contract I had secured through my own professional expertise would generate more revenue than Hartwell Digital Solutions had ever achieved, while being based entirely on my documented innovations, rather than his borrowed credibility. The CSBDC specifically requested proposals from the person responsible for creating the innovative small business marketing strategies that had been attributed to Hartwell Digital Solutions, I continued. Unfortunately for you, their research identified me as the actual architect of those strategies. The catalyst moment had arrived with perfect clarity. Derek's systematic betrayal had triggered consequences that would transfer his business ownership to me, while I simultaneously launched an independent venture that exceeded our previous success. "Derek," I said, meeting his devastated gaze directly, "I think you're beginning to understand that the evening you planned as a routine anniversary dinner has become the moment when 5 years of calculated deception finally produced the consequences you never bothered to anticipate." Derek's phone continued buzzing with increasing urgency, each notification chipping away at whatever composure he had left. The messages were coming from multiple contacts now, creating a cascade of panic that suggested his carefully compartmentalized deceptions were colliding in ways he had never anticipated. "It's not just Natasha," Derek said, his voice hollow as he scrolled through increasingly desperate communications. "James Mitchell from our office is asking why Morrison & Associates contacted him about intellectual property documentation and employee testimony regarding campaign development processes." Marcus looked up with renewed interest. "James Mitchell is one of your employees?" "Our lead account coordinator," I clarified. "He's worked closely with me on every major campaign for the past 3 years, documenting development processes and client communications as part of our quality assurance protocols." Derek's expression shifted to horror. "Elena, you've been coordinating with our own staff to document my supposed misconduct? You've turned our employees against me." "Have I?" I asked, maintaining my calm tone. "Or have I simply asked James to provide accurate testimony about who actually developed the campaigns that made our agency successful? I hadn't corrupted loyal employees or manipulated them into false testimony.
I had simply asked them to document the truth about our business operations, knowing that their honest observations would contradict Derek's public claims about his creative contributions. Marcus was studying Derek's phone messages with professional interest. Derek, it appears that multiple parties are beginning to understand that your business practices might not align with your public representations. When employees, clients, and business partners all receive inquiries about the same misconduct patterns, it suggests comprehensive investigation rather than isolated complaints. Derek's phone buzzed again, this time with a call from someone whose contact information made him visibly flinch. It's Catherine Miles from Denver Business Development. Catherine Miles, Marcus repeated. Isn't she the venture capitalist who's been considering investment in your agency expansion plans? She was, Derek replied miserably. We had a meeting scheduled next week to discuss potential funding for our planned acquisition of smaller marketing firms throughout Colorado. I smiled, remembering my conversation with Catherine 3 days earlier. Catherine and I had a very interesting discussion about the intellectual property foundations that would support any potential acquisition strategy. She was particularly interested in understanding who actually created the innovations that would be scaled across multiple markets. Derek's expansion plans, which he had been developing secretly with Natasha Chen's strategic input, were crumbling as potential investors discovered that the intellectual property supporting those plans belonged to someone else entirely. Elena, Derek said desperately, you can't destroy everything we've built together just because you're angry about personal complications that can be resolved through counseling and communication. Marcus's eyebrows rose at Derek's characterization of systematic business fraud and adultery as personal complications. Derek, we're not discussing relationship counseling. We're examining patterns of corporate espionage, intellectual property theft, and conspiracy to commit fraud. These are criminal matters that typically result in prosecution rather than therapy. Derek's phone erupted with another series of notifications from contacts whose panic was spreading through their professional network like wildfire. Rebecca Walsh from the Colorado Marketing Association wants to know why there are questions about my presentation credentials and whether the innovations I described at their conference were properly attributed to their original creators. Rebecca Walsh, I repeated, recalling my recent conversation with the association's ethics committee. She mentioned that several members had raised concerns about presenters who might be claiming credit for work that originated with other professionals. The association takes intellectual property protection very seriously. Derek's reputation in the industry was being systematically dismantled as professional organizations and potential business partners discovered that his claimed innovations belonged to someone else. The networking activities that had seemed so impressive were revealing themselves to be based on borrowed credibility that was now being challenged by documented evidence. Marcus gathered the expanding collection of evidence with methodical precision. Derek, at this point, you're facing coordinated investigation that involves multiple parties examining the same patterns of misconduct from different perspectives. Employees questioning your creative contributions, clients identifying the real source of their successful campaigns, investors discovering that your intellectual property doesn't belong to you. The conspiracy Derek had orchestrated with Natasha Chen was being exposed from multiple angles simultaneously, creating a comprehensive case that no amount of charm or legal maneuvering could overcome. There's something else you should understand, I said, retrieving a final folder. This investigation isn't just about our business partnership. Morrison & Associates has identified patterns suggesting that you and Natasha have been sharing client information and campaign strategies between competing agencies, which constitutes corporate espionage under Colorado business law. Derek's face went completely white. Elena, Natasha and I never shared confidential client information. Our discussions were about general industry trends and creative approaches. Marcus examined the evidence with professional skepticism. Derek, these email records show specific client campaign details being shared between you and Natasha Chen, including proprietary research data and strategic recommendations. Corporate espionage charges wouldn't require proof of malicious intent, only evidence that confidential business information was transferred between competing firms. The scope of Derek's legal exposure was expanding beyond anything he had anticipated. What had seemed like romantic betrayal with convenient business benefits was revealing itself to be a criminal conspiracy that would result in professional destruction for both participants. "Derek," I said, watching him struggle with the magnitude of his miscalculations, "I think you're beginning to understand that your supposedly clever planning has created legal consequences that extend far beyond losing a business partnership or paying divorce settlements." The systematic documentation that had seemed like unnecessary paranoia when I began maintaining it 18 months ago was now revealing itself to be the foundation of Derek's complete professional destruction. Marcus Chen studied my comprehensive evidence files with the appreciation of someone who understood exactly how difficult it was to build such ironclad cases against sophisticated financial criminals.
"Elena," Marcus said, his voice carrying professional admiration, "this level of documentation would satisfy the evidence requirements for any forensic accounting investigation I've conducted. You have timestamps, email correspondence, client communications, and employee testimony that creates an unbreakable chain of proof regarding intellectual property ownership and business misconduct." Derek's phone had finally stopped buzzing, though his expression suggested that the silence was more ominous than the previous cascade of panicked messages. "Elena, I need you to understand that if you pursue this investigation to its logical conclusion, you'll destroy more than just my career. The criminal charges you're threatening would affect Natasha, our employees, potentially even our clients." "Would they?" I asked, noting how Derek's concern for others had materialized only when his own consequences became undeniable. "Or would a thorough investigation simply document the truth about who created what innovations and who attempted to steal them through systematic deception?" Marcus was examining financial records that Derek had never seen before, documents I had requested from our accountant 3 weeks earlier when my suspicions about unauthorized business restructuring had crystallized. "Derek, these financial analyses reveal something interesting about your recent legal consultations. The asset protection strategies you've been developing would have transferred intellectual property ownership to a Delaware corporation that you control individually, effectively eliminating Elena's legal claims to the innovations she actually created. The financial manipulation was more sophisticated than I had initially understood, involving multiple legal entities and offshore account structures that would have made Derek's theft of my intellectual property nearly impossible to challenge through conventional partnership disputes. This corporate structure," Marcus continued, studying documents that chronicled Derek's asset protection planning, "would have been nearly impossible for Elena to challenge without the kind of comprehensive documentation she maintained. Most business partners who discovered this level of systematic theft would find themselves with insufficient evidence to prove their claims in court." Derek's silence confirmed what we all understood. His legal consultations hadn't been about tax optimization or routine business development. They had been about corporate theft, orchestrated through romantic deception, designed to transfer my life's work to his individual ownership while eliminating my ability to prove that the innovations had originated with my expertise. "There's something else you should both understand," I said, retrieving a folder that contained communications Derek definitely hadn't seen before. 2 weeks ago, I received a call from Sarah Martinez at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Corporate Crime Division. It seems that patterns involving intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, and interstate commerce violations had attracted their attention through reports from multiple sources. Derek's face underwent a remarkable transformation as he processed the implications of federal investigation into activities he had assumed were invisible to law enforcement scrutiny. "Elena, you contacted the FBI about our business partnership? That's an extreme escalation that could destroy both of our professional reputations, regardless of who's ultimately proven correct." Marcus examined the federal correspondence with professional interest. "Actually, Derek, Elena didn't contact the FBI. They contacted her after identifying patterns that suggested systematic corporate crime involving multiple victims across state lines. When intellectual property theft involves companies in different states, it becomes a federal matter that the Bureau investigates independently."
The scope of Derek's legal exposure was expanding beyond anything he could have anticipated when he began his affair with Natasha Chen. What had seemed like a localized business dispute between spouses was revealing itself to be part of a larger pattern that had attracted federal attention. Agent Martinez explained that my case fits a pattern they've been investigating for 18 months, I continued, watching Derek's expression cycle through disbelief and terror. Apparently, there have been multiple reports of business partners conducting affairs while systematically stealing intellectual property from their romantic victims, using personal relationships to mask corporate crimes. Derek's systematic theft of my innovations wasn't an isolated crime, but part of a broader criminal pattern that federal investigators had been tracking across multiple states and business sectors. His romance with Natasha Chen wasn't just adultery. It was a sophisticated corporate crime scheme that had attracted federal prosecution interest.
Marcus was studying the federal documentation with growing comprehension of Derek's true legal exposure. Derek, if the FBI has been investigating this pattern for 18 months and they've identified your case as fitting their established criminal framework, you're facing potential federal prosecution rather than just civil partnership disputes. The penalties for federal corporate espionage charges include substantial prison sentences and complete financial forfeiture. The restaurant around us continued its elegant evening service, with other couples enjoying romantic celebrations while remaining completely unaware that federal crimes were being documented at our table. Agent Martinez mentioned that cooperating witnesses in similar cases had received substantial sentence reductions in exchange for testimony about their criminal partners, I added, noting how Derek's panic was reaching levels that suggested complete psychological breakdown. Apparently, the Bureau is particularly interested in prosecuting the organizational leaders of these intellectual property theft schemes, rather than the romantic participants who might have been manipulated into cooperation. Derek stared at me with growing comprehension that his supposed criminal mastermind role might actually make him the primary target of federal prosecution, while Natasha Chen's cooperation with investigators could result in significantly reduced consequences for her participation in their scheme. Marcus gathered the federal documents with methodical precision. Derek, at this point, you're facing a choice between federal prosecution as the leader of a corporate espionage conspiracy or cooperation with investigators who might be willing to consider reduced charges in exchange for complete disclosure of your criminal activities and financial records. The evidence that had seemed like excessive documentation when I began maintaining it was now providing federal prosecutors with everything they needed to pursue criminal charges that would result in Derek's complete financial and professional destruction. Derek, I said, meeting his devastated gaze directly, I think you're beginning to understand that the intellectual property you attempted to steal through systematic deception was protected by more than just partnership agreements and civil courts. When you chose to build your future on foundations that belonged to someone else, you activated legal consequences that extend far beyond business disputes into criminal prosecution that will determine the rest of your life. His silence confirmed what federal investigators had already documented. The charming entrepreneur who had built his reputation on stolen innovations was about to discover that systematic corporate crime carries consequences that no amount of charm or legal maneuvering can overcome. The transformation of Marcus Chen from confused dinner guest to strategic ally had been one of the evening's most satisfying developments. His forensic accounting expertise provided professional validation for suspicions I had been harboring for months, while his personal investigation in exposing Derek and Natasha's betrayal created a partnership that neither of our spouses had anticipated when they began their affair. Elena, Marcus said, studying the federal documentation with renewed focus, I think we should discuss how to coordinate our responses to ensure that both Derek and Natasha face appropriate consequences for their systematic deception. My professional experience with corporate fraud investigations suggests that victims who work together typically achieve better outcomes than those who pursue separate legal strategies. The suggestion made perfect strategic sense. Derek and Natasha had coordinated their betrayal across multiple fronts, sharing client information while planning to eliminate their respective spouses from businesses we had built through our expertise and dedication.
Their conspiracy deserved a coordinated response that would address both the personal and professional dimensions of their systematic misconduct. What did you have in mind? I asked, appreciating how Marcus's analytical approach complemented my own strategic planning capabilities. Marcus retrieved a business card from his wallet and placed it on our table. My firm, Chen & Associates, specializes in forensic accounting for corporate fraud cases. We work regularly with federal investigators and defense attorneys to provide comprehensive financial analysis for complex business crimes. I'd like to offer our services to support your case against Derek, particularly given that my personal investment in exposing this conspiracy ensures that we'll provide our most thorough investigative efforts. Derek's expression shifted to something approaching terror as he processed the implications of having his financial activities analyzed by someone with Marcus's professional expertise and personal motivation. Marcus, I understand that you're upset about Natasha's involvement in our consulting relationship, but bringing forensic accounting firms into what should be a private matter between spouses seems unnecessarily aggressive. Does it? Marcus asked, his tone carrying the cold precision of someone who had spent years investigating financial criminals. Because the offshore account structures and intellectual property transfers you've been planning suggest systematic fraud that extends far beyond private spousal matters into federal crimes that affect multiple victims. The alliance between Marcus and me was creating investigative capabilities that Derek's individual legal representation couldn't hope to match. His attempts to steal my intellectual property through romantic deception were being challenged by professional expertise that would expose every financial manipulation he had orchestrated during months of secret planning. There's something else you should understand, I said, retrieving my phone and opening a contact list that Derek had never seen before. Over the past 3 weeks, I've been building relationships with other business professionals who have experienced similar patterns of systematic betrayal from romantic partners who attempted to steal their intellectual property. Derek's face went pale as he processed the implications of coordinated victim testimony that would support federal prosecution of the criminal pattern he and Natasha had been implementing. Elena, you've been organizing some kind of victim support group to coordinate testimony against me? I've been connecting with other professionals whose experiences match the FBI's investigation into systematic corporate espionage schemes, I corrected. Agent Martinez mentioned that victim coordination often provides crucial evidence for prosecuting the organizational leaders of these criminal conspiracies. Marcus examined my contact list with professional interest. Elena, this network represents substantial testimonial evidence that would support federal prosecution. When multiple victims report identical patterns of intellectual property theft through romantic deception, it establishes the systematic nature required for serious criminal charges. The network I had built included 7 other business professionals across 4 states, each of whom had experienced systematic theft of their innovations by romantic partners who conducted affairs while planning to eliminate their victims from businesses built on stolen intellectual property. Our collective testimony would provide federal prosecutors with everything needed to demonstrate that Derek's crimes were part of a broader criminal enterprise rather than isolated misconduct. Dr. Patricia Williams from Austin described how her research partner conducted an affair while transferring her pharmaceutical research to competing firms, I explained, noting how Derek's panic was reaching levels that suggested complete psychological breakdown. Michael Torres from Phoenix documented how his business partner used romantic relationships to steal construction industry innovations worth millions of dollars. The patterns are identical across multiple cases. Marcus was studying the victim network with growing appreciation for the scope of federal interest in these crimes. Elena, this level of victim coordination typically results in federal task force investigations that pursue criminal charges against every participant in the conspiracy. Derek and Natasha aren't just facing prosecution for their individual crimes, they're facing charges as part of a criminal enterprise that spans multiple states and business sectors. The restaurant around us continued its elegant evening service, though our table had become an impromptu command center for coordinating federal prosecution of systematic corporate crimes. Other couples celebrated anniversaries while remaining unaware that criminal conspiracies were being dismantled through strategic victim cooperation just feet away from their romantic dinners. Agent Martinez explained that the Bureau's Corporate Crime Division has been building cases against this criminal network for 2 years, I continued, watching Derek's expressions cycle through disbelief and despair. Apparently, the intellectual property theft scheme has generated over $40 million in stolen innovations across multiple industries, making it one of the largest corporate espionage investigations in federal law enforcement history.
Derek stared at the victim contact list, as if it contained a death sentence, clearly understanding that his individual crimes were being prosecuted as part of a criminal enterprise that carried life-altering penalties. His romantic affair with Natasha Chen wasn't just adultery, it was participation in organized crime that had attracted federal task force attention. Marcus gathered the alliance documentation with methodical precision. Derek, at this point you're facing prosecution as part of a criminal enterprise that has stolen $40 million in intellectual property from victims across multiple states. The federal penalties for organized corporate espionage include decades in prison and complete financial forfeiture of all assets obtained through criminal activity. The alliance between Marcus and me, supported by federal investigators and coordinated victim testimony, had created legal consequences that no individual defense strategy could overcome. Derek's systematic theft of my innovations was being prosecuted as part of organized crime that threatened the foundation of intellectual property protection across multiple business sectors. There's one final thing you should understand, I said, meeting Derek's devastated gaze directly. This alliance isn't just about ensuring that you and Natasha face appropriate consequences for your crimes. It's about protecting other potential victims from experiencing the systematic betrayal that we've documented through our coordinated investigation. Derek's silence confirmed what federal task force investigators had already established. The charming entrepreneur who had built his reputation on stolen innovations was about to become a federal prosecution target whose cooperation might be the only factor that prevented him from spending the rest of his life in prison for organized corporate espionage. The comprehensive legal strategy that had seemed like excessive paranoia when I began developing it 6 months earlier was now revealing itself to be the foundation of Derek's complete destruction. Marcus Chen studied my strategic preparation files with the professional appreciation of someone who understood exactly how difficult it was to build such ironclad cases against sophisticated corporate criminals who used romantic relationships to mask systematic fraud. "Elena," Marcus said, his voice carrying both professional admiration and personal satisfaction, "this level of strategic preparation demonstrates remarkable foresight. You've anticipated every possible defense strategy Derek might attempt while building multiple layers of evidence that would satisfy the requirements for both civil and criminal prosecution." The strategic preparation had involved coordinating with legal experts across multiple specialties, each of whom contributed expertise that addressed different aspects of Derek's systematic misconduct. Intellectual property attorneys had secured comprehensive protection for my innovations, corporate lawyers had documented the partnership agreement violations, and federal prosecutors had been provided with evidence that supported organized crime charges. The preparation began 6 months ago when I started noticing patterns in Derek's behavior that suggested he was planning something that would affect our business partnership, I explained, retrieving a timeline that chronicled my strategic development process. The late nights he claimed were networking events, the mysterious legal consultations he described as routine business optimization, the way he started presenting my innovations as his individual breakthroughs during industry conferences. Derek's face had taken on the pale, hollow appearance of someone whose entire world was collapsing in slow motion. "Elena, you've been planning my destruction for 6 months while pretending to be a supportive wife and business partner. That level of systematic deception makes you just as manipulative as you claim I've been." Marcus examined the strategic timeline with professional interest. "Actually, Derek, Elena's preparation appears to be defensive rather than offensive. She documented your misconduct and protected herself from the consequences of trusting someone whose character proved unreliable. The difference between defensive preparation and offensive deception is crucial in both legal and ethical terms." The distinction was important, though Derek was clearly too panicked to appreciate the nuance. I hadn't orchestrated his affair with Natasha Chen, or forced him to steal credit for my innovations, or compelled him to plan my elimination from the business I had built. I had simply recognized patterns that suggested betrayal and prepared legal protections that would activate when his misconduct became undeniable.
The strategic preparation involved coordinating with multiple professional consultants, I continued, opening a folder that contained communications Derek had never seen. Morrison & Associates handled intellectual property protection, Chen & Associates provided forensic accounting analysis, and Thornton Legal Services managed partnership agreement enforcement. Each firm contributed expertise that addressed different aspects of your systematic misconduct. Derek stared at the professional coordination documents with growing comprehension that his individual legal representation couldn't possibly match the comprehensive strategy I had been developing with expert guidance for months. His attempts to steal my business through romantic deception were being challenged by coordinated professional expertise that anticipated every possible defense or counterattack he might attempt. "There's something else you should understand," I said, retrieving a tablet that contained video recordings Derek definitely hadn't known existed. 3 months ago, I began documenting our business meetings and personal conversations to ensure that any claims you made about our partnership arrangements would be supported by objective evidence rather than conflicting testimony. Derek's expression shifted to something approaching terror as he processed the implications of recorded evidence that could demonstrate his systematic planning to eliminate me from our business partnership. "Alina, you've been secretly recording our private conversations for months? That's potentially illegal surveillance that could invalidate any evidence you've collected." Marcus studied the recording documentation with professional expertise. "Actually, Derek, Colorado is a single-party consent state for recording conversations. Elena had every legal right to document discussions about business partnerships where she was a participant, particularly if she suspected that misconduct was being planned." The recorded conversations provided objective documentation of Derek's systematic planning to transfer my intellectual property to his individual ownership while eliminating my legal claims through corporate restructuring that I had never agreed to support. His own words, captured through legal recording methods, created evidence that no amount of legal maneuvering could challenge or dismiss. The recordings include our discussions about business restructuring, your explanations of the legal consultations you claimed were routine optimization, and your presentations of my innovations as your individual creative breakthroughs, I explained, noting how Derek's panic was reaching levels that suggested complete psychological breakdown. Agent Martinez mentioned that recorded evidence typically provides crucial support for federal prosecution of corporate espionage cases. Derek's systematic theft of my innovations hadn't just been documented through written records, it had been captured through audio evidence that demonstrated his deliberate planning to eliminate me from the business empire I had built through my expertise and strategic thinking. Marcus was examining the recording files with growing appreciation for their legal value. "Alina, this audio documentation would satisfy the evidence requirements for any federal prosecution involving corporate espionage or organized fraud. When criminals document their own planning through recorded conversations, it provides prosecutors with unassailable proof of criminal intent." The strategic preparation had created multiple layers of evidence that supported both civil partnership dissolution and federal criminal prosecution, ensuring that Derek's systematic betrayal would result in comprehensive consequences regardless of which legal framework proved most effective for securing justice. "There's one final aspect of the strategic preparation you should understand," I said, opening a communication thread that contained correspondence with federal prosecutors. Agent Martinez explained that victims who provide comprehensive evidence and strategic cooperation typically receive priority consideration for asset recovery and restitution, while perpetrators who refuse to cooperate face maximum penalties under federal sentencing guidelines. Derek stared at the federal correspondence as if it contained his death warrant, clearly understanding that his refusal to acknowledge his crimes was positioning him for the harshest possible consequences, while my cooperation with investigators would ensure that I recovered everything he had attempted to steal. Marcus gathered the strategic preparation documents with methodical precision. "Derek, Elena's strategic preparation has created a legal framework that ensures you face comprehensive consequences for your systematic misconduct while protecting her interests regardless of how you choose to respond. The coordination between civil and criminal proceedings means that your assets, reputation, and freedom are all at risk simultaneously. The strategic preparation that had required months of careful coordination with legal experts was now providing the foundation for Derek's complete destruction, while ensuring that I would emerge from his betrayal with my innovations protected, my business interests secured, and my professional reputation enhanced by the recognition that I had been the true architect of our success. "Derek," I said, meeting his devastated gaze directly, "I think you're beginning to understand that the systematic betrayal you orchestrated with Natasha Chen was anticipated and countered by strategic preparation that will ensure you face consequences proportional to the scope of your misconduct." His silence confirmed what the strategic preparation had been designed to accomplish. The charming entrepreneur who had built his reputation on stolen innovations was discovering that systematic corporate crime carries consequences that no individual defense strategy can overcome when the victim has prepared for betrayal with the same thoroughness that the perpetrator used to plan their crimes. The months of maintaining a facade of marital normalcy while building a comprehensive case against Derek's systematic betrayal had required acting skills I never knew I possessed. Every morning, I had woken beside the man who was orchestrating my professional destruction and performed the role of devoted wife with expertise that surprised even me. The emotional toll of this double life had been substantial, but the strategic necessity was undeniable. The most challenging aspect, I explained to Marcus while Derek sat in stunned silence, was maintaining normal interactions during business meetings where Derek presented my innovations as his creative breakthroughs. I had to smile supportively while he claimed credit for work that represented months of my individual effort. Marcus nodded with the understanding of someone who had investigated similar cases of systematic deception. That level of emotional control requires remarkable strength, Elena. Most victims of corporate fraud discover the betrayal through crisis rather than strategic investigation, which limits their ability to build comprehensive evidence. Derek finally found his voice, though it carried none of its usual confidence. "Elena, you've been living a lie for months while accusing me of deception. The systematic planning you're describing makes you just as manipulative as you claim I've been." "Does it?" I asked, maintaining the calm tone that had become second nature during months of careful performance. "I documented your crimes while protecting myself from their consequences. You committed crimes while planning to eliminate me from the business I built. The difference between defensive preparation and offensive betrayal seems obvious." The double life had required maintaining Derek's confidence in his supposed superiority while systematically gathering evidence that would destroy his professional reputation and financial security. Every supportive gesture during his public presentations had been calculated to ensure he continued revealing the scope of his intellectual property theft through his own arrogant claims. The business meetings were particularly surreal, I continued, opening a folder that contained notes from industry conferences where Derek had presented my work. I would sit in audiences while Derek described innovative strategies that I had developed during late evening hours, presenting them as his entrepreneurial vision while I documented his systematic credit theft. Marcus examined the conference documentation with professional interest. These presentation records create a clear timeline of intellectual property theft that would support both civil and criminal prosecution. When perpetrators document their own crimes through public presentations, it provides prosecutors with unassailable evidence. Derek's expression had shifted to something approaching desperation as he processed the implications of his own public statements being used as evidence against him. "Elena, those presentations represented our collaborative work as business partners. When I presented our innovations publicly, I was representing both of us as a team." "Were you?" I asked, retrieving transcripts that contradicted his claims. "Because these recordings consistently reference my vision, my breakthrough, and my innovative approach rather than discussing our partnership or acknowledging collaborative development." The double life had reached its most difficult phase 3 weeks earlier, when Derek began discussing his plans for eliminating me from our business partnership during private conversations I was secretly recording. Listening to him describe my removal from the company I had built while maintaining the facade of supportive wife had required emotional control that pushed me to my psychological limits. The final weeks were the most challenging, I admitted, noting how Derek's panic was reaching levels that suggested complete psychological breakdown. Derek started discussing his restructuring plans more openly, apparently confident that his supportive wife would never suspect his intentions or challenge his authority. Derek stared at me with growing comprehension that his arrogance had blinded him to the possibility that his accommodating wife might be building a case against him. Elena, if you suspected misconduct, you should have confronted me directly rather than conducting a secret investigation that violated the trust fundamental to marriage. Marcus's expression suggested he found Derek's appeal to marital trust somewhat ironic given the circumstances. Derek, conducting secret investigations to document suspected crimes is standard practice in forensic accounting. Elena's methodology was professional and thorough, which is more consideration than most corporate fraud perpetrators receive from their victims. The double life was finally ending, replaced by the satisfaction of watching Derek confront the comprehensive consequences of systematic betrayal he had never bothered to consider. His confidence in his own cleverness had made him incurious about his wife's activities, assuming that my life revolved entirely around supporting his ambitions without question or documentation. "There's something else you should understand," I said, meeting Derek's devastated gaze directly. "The double life I maintained for months was designed to give you every opportunity to reconsider your betrayal and choose a different path. You could have acknowledged my contributions, discontinued your affair, or proposed genuine partnership restructuring that protected both our interests." Derek's silence confirmed what the double life had been designed to test. His systematic betrayal wasn't a momentary mistake or emotional weakness. It was calculated exploitation that continued even when circumstances provided multiple opportunities for him to choose differently. The anniversary dinner at the Meridian had been deliberately chosen as the setting for Derek's final confrontation, though he remained unaware that every detail of the evening had been orchestrated to maximize the impact of his psychological collapse. The elegant restaurant where he had proposed 5 years earlier would now witness the systematic dismantling of everything he believed he had built through his charm and strategic deception. "Derek," I said, noting how his hands trembled as he reached for his wine glass, "do you remember why you chose the Meridian for your proposal? You said it represented the kind of success we would build together through partnership and mutual support." The irony was deliberate and pointed. Derek's romantic gesture 5 years earlier had taken place in the same location where his systematic betrayal would be exposed through evidence he had never suspected existed. The restaurant that symbolized our partnership's beginning would witness its conclusion under circumstances that revealed the true nature of his character. Marcus was observing Derek's psychological deterioration with professional interest. "Elena, the choice of location demonstrates remarkable strategic thinking. Confronting corporate fraud perpetrators in settings that carry personal significance often produces more complete confessions than formal legal proceedings." Derek's expression had shifted to something that looked like genuine terror as he processed the implications of Marcus's observation. "Elena, you planned this entire evening to trap me into admissions that would support your legal case against me. The anniversary dinner, the restaurant choice, even Marcus's presence, all of it was calculated to manipulate me into incriminating myself." "Was it manipulation?" I asked, maintaining the calm tone that seemed to unsettle him more than accusations would have. "Or was it simply creating circumstances where your true character would be revealed through your own choices and statements?" The trap had been set through months of careful preparation that anticipated Derek's psychological patterns and strategic vulnerabilities. His arrogance and overconfidence had made him susceptible to situations where he would reveal more than intended, particularly when he believed himself safely in control of relationship dynamics. The timing was crucial, I explained, opening a final folder that contained communications Derek had never seen. 3 days ago, Natasha sent you a message about finalizing your restructuring plans before the end of the month. I knew that tonight's anniversary dinner would represent your last opportunity to maintain the facade of marital normalcy before implementing your elimination strategy. Derek stared at the message thread with growing comprehension that his private communications with Natasha had been monitored and analyzed for strategic intelligence that informed the timing of his confrontation. Elena, you've been intercepting my communications with Natasha? That's potentially illegal surveillance that could invalidate your entire case. Marcus examined the communication evidence with professional expertise. Actually, Derek, these appear to be messages you received on devices that Elena had legitimate access to as your business partner and spouse. Discovering evidence of criminal conspiracy through legally accessible communications is standard practice in corporate fraud investigations. The trap had been designed to activate Derek's own psychological weaknesses against him, using his confidence in his supposed superiority to ensure he would provide comprehensive evidence of his systematic betrayal through his own statements and admissions. His need to appear clever and in control had made him vulnerable to strategic questioning that revealed more than he intended. There's something else you should understand, I said, retrieving a device Derek had never seen before. This evening's conversation has been recorded through equipment provided by federal investigators to ensure that any admissions you made would be documented for potential prosecution. Derek's face went completely white as he processed the implications of federal recording equipment that had captured his admissions about intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, and systematic fraud. Elena, you're wearing federal surveillance equipment to our anniversary dinner? That level of betrayal makes you just as deceptive as you claim I've been. Does it? I asked, noting how his appeal to moral equivalency ignored the fundamental difference between documenting crimes and committing them. I'm cooperating with federal investigators to document systematic corporate espionage. You've been conducting systematic corporate espionage while maintaining a facade of marital loyalty. The trap had succeeded beyond my most optimistic expectations. Derek's own statements, captured through federal recording equipment in the presence of a forensic accounting witness, had provided prosecutors with everything needed to pursue maximum penalties under organized crime statutes but carried decades in prison. Marcus gathered the recording equipment with methodical precision. Derek, at this point, you've provided federal investigators with comprehensive admissions regarding intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The recording evidence eliminates any possibility of challenging the charges through claims of insufficient proof or prosecutorial overreach. The elegant anniversary dinner that Derek had expected to be a routine performance of marital happiness had become the moment when 5 years of systematic betrayal produced consequences that would determine the rest of his life. His confidence in his own cleverness had led him directly into a trap that documented his crimes through his own words. There's something else you should understand, I said, retrieving a device Derek had never seen before. This evening's conversation has been recorded through equipment provided by federal investigators to ensure that any admissions you made would be documented for potential prosecution. Derek's face went completely white as he processed the implications of federal recording equipment that had captured his admissions about intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, and systematic fraud. Elena, you're wearing federal surveillance equipment to our anniversary dinner? That level of betrayal makes you just as deceptive as you claim I've been. Does it? I asked, noting how his appeal to moral equivalency ignored the fundamental difference between documenting crimes and committing them. I'm cooperating with federal investigators to document systematic corporate espionage. You've been conducting systematic corporate espionage while maintaining a facade of marital loyalty. The trap had succeeded beyond my most optimistic expectations. Derek's own statements, captured through federal recording equipment in the presence of a forensic accounting witness, had provided prosecutors with everything needed to pursue maximum penalties under organized crime statutes that carried decades in prison. Marcus gathered the recording equipment with methodical precision. Derek, at this point, you've provided federal investigators with comprehensive admissions regarding intellectual property theft, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to commit fraud. The recording evidence eliminates any possibility of challenging the charges through claims of insufficient proof or prosecutorial overreach. The elegant anniversary dinner that Derek had expected to be a routine performance of marital happiness had become the moment when 5 years of systematic betrayal produced consequences that would determine the rest of his life. His confidence in his own cleverness had led him directly into a trap that documented his crimes through his own words. "Derek," I said, meeting his devastated gaze directly, "I think you're beginning to understand that the anniversary dinner you planned as another performance of successful partnership has become the moment when your systematic betrayal finally produced the comprehensive consequences you never bothered to anticipate." His silence confirmed what the trap had been designed to accomplish. The charming entrepreneur who had built his reputation on stolen innovations was discovering that federal surveillance equipment captures admissions that no amount of legal maneuvering can explain away or dismiss. The moment of complete revelation arrived when Derek's phone rang with a call that would shatter the last vestiges of his carefully constructed facade. The caller ID displayed Agent Martinez, FBI, and Derek's face underwent a transformation that revealed the true scope of his terror as federal law enforcement made direct contact during our anniversary dinner. "Derek Hartwell," Agent Martinez's voice carried clearly through the phone speaker, loud enough for Marcus and me to hear every word. "This is Agent Sarah Martinez from the FBI's Corporate Crime Division. We need to discuss your involvement in a federal investigation regarding systematic intellectual property theft and corporate espionage. Are you available for an interview tomorrow morning at our Denver field office?" Derek's hands trembled as he processed the implications of federal agents requesting interviews about crimes he had assumed were invisible to law enforcement scrutiny. "Agent Martinez, I'm not sure what investigation you're referring to. I haven't been involved in any activities that would warrant federal attention." Marcus was observing Derek's phone conversation with professional fascination, clearly recognizing the interrogation techniques that federal investigators used when building cases against corporate fraud perpetrators. "Derek, Agent Martinez is providing you with an opportunity to cooperate voluntarily before formal charges are filed. That's typically the last chance suspects receive to minimize their legal exposure through cooperation." Agent Martinez's voice continued through the phone speaker with professional authority. "Mr. Hartwell, we have comprehensive evidence regarding your participation in a multi-state corporate espionage conspiracy involving intellectual property theft, unauthorized business restructuring, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Your cooperation with our investigation could significantly affect the charges you ultimately face." Derek stared at his phone as if it contained a venomous snake, clearly understanding that federal investigators had been building a case against him while he remained completely unaware of their surveillance and evidence gathering. "Agent Martinez, I think there might be some misunderstanding about my business activities. I've never been involved in corporate espionage or conspiracy to commit fraud." "Haven't you?" I asked, retrieving the comprehensive evidence portfolio that had been assembled through months of strategic documentation. "Because these recorded conversations suggest otherwise, Derek. Your own words describe systematic plans to eliminate me from our business partnership while transferring my intellectual property to your individual ownership." The revelation was unfolding exactly as Agent Martinez had predicted when she briefed me on confrontation strategies that would maximize the psychological impact of federal prosecution. Derek's confidence in his supposed cleverness was collapsing as he realized that federal investigators had been monitoring his activities while building cases that would result in decades in prison. Marcus examined Derek's phone with professional interest. "Derek, federal investigators typically contact suspects directly only when they have sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges. Agent Martinez is offering you an opportunity to cooperate before your case moves to prosecution, which suggests that your legal exposure is substantial." Derek's expression had shifted to something approaching complete psychological breakdown as he processed the implications of federal prosecution for crimes he had convinced himself were sophisticated business strategies rather than criminal conspiracies. Elena, you've been working with federal investigators to build a case against me while pretending to be a supportive wife and business partner. Have I been pretending? I asked, noting how his appeal to marital loyalty ignored his systematic betrayal of both our marriage and business partnership. Or have I been protecting myself and other potential victims from the consequences of trusting someone whose character proved to be fundamentally criminal? Agent Martinez's voice returned through the phone speaker with increased urgency. Mr. Hartwell, we're prepared to proceed with formal charges if you prefer not to cooperate voluntarily. However, I should mention that your co-conspirator Natasha Chen has already expressed interest in cooperation that would provide substantial testimony regarding your leadership role in this criminal enterprise. Derek's face went completely white as he processed the implications of Natasha's cooperation with federal investigators. His romantic partner was apparently prioritizing her own legal interests over their relationship, providing testimony that would position Derek as the primary organizer of their criminal conspiracy. Marcus was studying Derek's reaction with professional appreciation. Federal interrogation techniques: when co-conspirators begin cooperating with federal investigators, the remaining suspects typically face maximum penalties under organized crime statutes. Natasha's testimony could result in charges that carry life sentences for criminal enterprise leadership. The revelation was complete and devastating. Derek's systematic theft of my intellectual property had evolved into federal crimes that attracted organized crime prosecution, while his romantic partner was cooperating with investigators to minimize her own consequences by providing testimony that would maximize his punishment.
There's something else you should understand, I said, meeting Derek's devastated gaze directly. Agent Martinez explained that victims who provide comprehensive cooperation typically receive priority consideration for asset recovery and restitution, while perpetrators who refuse to acknowledge their crimes face maximum penalties under federal sentencing guidelines. Derek stared at the federal evidence as if it represented his death sentence, finally understanding that his systematic betrayal had produced consequences that extended far beyond business partnership disputes into criminal prosecution that would determine whether he spent the rest of his life in federal prison. Derek, Agent Martinez's voice concluded through the phone speaker, we'll expect you at our Denver field office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for your voluntary interview. I strongly recommend that you bring legal representation who specializes in federal corporate crime defense. The revelation moment was complete. Derek's charming entrepreneur persona had been systematically dismantled, revealing someone whose entire professional identity had been built on criminal foundations that would now result in federal prosecution under organized crime statutes that carried consequences he had never imagined possible. The immediate aftermath of Agent Martinez's phone call transformed our elegant anniversary dinner into something resembling a crime scene, though the only evidence being processed was Derek's complete psychological collapse as the scope of his legal exposure became undeniable. His hands shook uncontrollably as he set down his phone, clearly understanding that federal investigators possessed comprehensive evidence that would result in criminal charges regardless of any defense strategy he might attempt. Derek, Agent Martinez's voice concluded through the phone speaker, we'll expect you at our Denver field office tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock for your voluntary interview. I strongly recommend that you bring legal representation who specializes in federal corporate crime defense. The revelation moment was complete. Derek's charming entrepreneur persona had been systematically dismantled, revealing someone whose entire professional identity had been built on criminal foundations that would now result in federal prosecution under organized crime statutes that carried consequences he had never imagined possible. The immediate aftermath of Agent Martinez's phone call transformed our elegant anniversary dinner into something resembling a crime scene, though the only evidence being processed was Derek's complete psychological collapse as the scope of his legal exposure became undeniable. His hands shook uncontrollably as he set down his phone, clearly understanding that federal investigators possessed comprehensive evidence that would result in criminal charges regardless of any defense strategy he might attempt.
Alina, Derek said, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone whose entire world had just evaporated, we need to discuss how to handle this situation in ways that minimize damage to both of our professional reputations. If federal investigators pursue criminal charges, the publicity could destroy everything we've built together, even if the accusations ultimately prove unfounded. Marcus examined Derek's desperate attempt to reframe federal prosecution as a mutual problem with barely concealed incredulity. Derek, you're facing organized crime charges for systematic corporate espionage. Elena is a cooperating witness whose testimony will help prosecutors secure convictions. The damage to your respective reputations isn't comparable. The immediate consequences were cascading through Derek's professional network with devastating efficiency. His phone continued buzzing with notifications from business contacts who had apparently received inquiries from federal investigators about Derek's intellectual property claims and business restructuring activities. Each message represented another professional relationship being severed as associates distanced themselves from someone facing federal prosecution. James Mitchell just texted that Morrison and Associates contacted him, requesting detailed testimony about campaign development processes and intellectual property ownership, Derek said, reading through messages with growing horror. They're interviewing our entire staff about my supposed misconduct. I nodded, appreciating how efficiently federal investigators were documenting the scope of Derek's intellectual property theft through employee testimony that would provide unassailable evidence for prosecution. James has always been meticulous about documenting who actually creates our campaign innovations. His testimony will be particularly valuable for prosecutors. Derek stared at his phone as more professional contacts sent increasingly panicked messages about federal inquiries into his business practices. Catherine Miles canceled our investor meeting and suggested that I retain criminal defense counsel before attempting any future business communications. Patricia Walsh from the Marketing Association sent a formal notice that my presentation credentials are being reviewed for potential ethics violations. Marcus was observing Derek's professional destruction with the detached fascination of someone who had witnessed similar patterns during corporate fraud investigations. Derek, when federal investigators begin interviewing business associates about systematic misconduct, the professional consequences typically prove more devastating than the legal penalties. Your reputation in the industry is being permanently destroyed, regardless of how criminal proceedings conclude. The immediate consequences extended beyond professional destruction into financial devastation as Derek's assets were being frozen pending federal investigation. His access to business accounts had been suspended, his credit lines canceled, and his investment portfolios placed under judicial review that would determine what assets had been obtained through criminal activity. The bank called to inform me that our business accounts are being frozen pending federal investigation into potential money laundering and asset concealment, Derek said, his voice barely above a whisper. They mentioned that joint accounts would remain accessible to Alina as the cooperating partner, but my individual accounts are completely inaccessible. I appreciated how efficiently federal financial investigators had identified and protected assets that belonged to legitimate business operations while isolating resources that Derek had obtained through systematic fraud. Agent Martinez explained that asset protection for cooperating witnesses typically ensures that victims recover everything that was stolen while perpetrators lose access to criminal proceeds. Derek's immediate financial situation had shifted from wealthy entrepreneur to someone who couldn't access funds to pay for the criminal defense legal representation he desperately needed. His systematic theft of my intellectual property had generated substantial wealth that was now being seized by federal investigators as proceeds of organized crime. The restaurant around us continued its elegant evening service, though our table had become an impromptu command center for processing the immediate consequences of federal prosecution that would reshape Derek's entire existence. Other couples celebrated anniversaries while remaining unaware that a criminal enterprise was being dismantled just feet away from their romantic dinners. There's something else you should understand, I said, noting how Derek's panic was reaching levels that suggested complete psychological breakdown. Tomorrow morning's interview with Agent Martinez isn't optional. Federal investigators have sufficient evidence to arrest you if you fail to appear voluntarily for questioning. Derek stared at me with growing comprehension that his cooperation with federal investigators was being secured through threats of immediate arrest rather than appeals to his better judgment. Elena, you've coordinated with federal agents to ensure that I have no choice except cooperation that will incriminate me in crimes I never intended to commit. Marcus's expression suggested he found Derek's claim about unintentional crimes somewhat unconvincing given the systematic nature of his intellectual property theft and corporate espionage. Derek, federal investigators typically pursue organized crime charges only when they have evidence of deliberate criminal planning rather than accidental misconduct. The immediate consequences had eliminated every escape route Derek might have imagined while positioning him for maximum legal exposure under federal statutes that carried decades in prison. His systematic betrayal of our marriage and business partnership had evolved into criminal prosecution that would determine whether he retained any freedom for the rest of his life. Derek, I said, meeting his devastated gaze directly, I think you're beginning to understand that the immediate consequences of your systematic betrayal are just the beginning of a legal process that will strip away everything you obtained through criminal activity while ensuring that justice is served proportional to the scope of your misconduct. The transformation from Derek's confident arrival at the Meridian 3 hours earlier to his current position as a federal prosecution target represented one of the most complete reversals of fortune I had ever witnessed. The man who had entered our anniversary dinner expecting to maintain his facade of successful entrepreneur while secretly coordinating his future with Natasha Chen was now facing criminal charges that would strip away everything he had obtained through systematic fraud. Elena, Derek said, his voice carrying the hollow desperation of someone whose entire identity had been revealed as criminal fiction, I need you to understand that if you continue cooperating with federal investigators, you'll destroy more than just my career. The criminal charges they're pursuing could result in prison sentences that would eliminate any possibility of rebuilding our relationship or business partnership. Marcus observed Derek's appeal for mercy with the professional detachment of someone who had witnessed similar patterns during corporate fraud investigations. Derek, you're facing organized crime charges for systematic intellectual property theft. The relationship and business partnership you're asking Elena to protect were built on criminal foundations that never legitimately belonged to you. The immediate consequences had eliminated every escape route Derek might have imagined, while positioning him for maximum legal exposure under federal statutes that carried decades in prison. His systematic betrayal of our marriage and business partnership had evolved into criminal prosecution that would determine whether he retained any freedom for the rest of his life. Derek, I said, meeting his devastated gaze directly, I think you're beginning to understand that the immediate consequences of your systematic betrayal are just the beginning of a legal process that will strip away everything you obtained through criminal activity while ensuring that justice is served proportional to the scope of your misconduct. The transformation from Derek's confident arrival at the Meridian 3 hours earlier to his current position as a federal prosecution target represented one of the most complete reversals of fortune I had ever witnessed. The man who had entered our anniversary dinner expecting to maintain his facade of successful entrepreneur while secretly coordinating his future with Natasha Chen was now facing criminal charges that would strip away everything he had obtained through systematic fraud. Elena, Derek said, his voice carrying the hollow desperation of someone whose entire identity had been revealed as criminal fiction, I need you to understand that if you continue cooperating with federal investigators, you'll destroy more than just my career. The criminal charges they're pursuing could result in prison sentences that would eliminate any possibility of rebuilding our relationship or business partnership. Marcus observed Derek's appeal for mercy with the professional detachment of someone who had witnessed similar patterns during corporate fraud investigations. Derek, you're facing organized crime charges for systematic intellectual property theft. The relationship and business partnership you're asking Elena to protect were built on criminal foundations that never legitimately belonged to you.
The role reversal was complete and devastating. Derek had spent 5 years positioning himself as the visionary entrepreneur while treating me as supportive assistants whose contributions could be minimized or eliminated when convenient. Now he was begging for protection from the woman whose innovations he had systematically stolen while planning her elimination from the empire she had actually built.
The federal prosecution timeline suggests that you'll be arrested within 48 hours unless you cooperate with investigators by providing complete disclosure of your criminal activities and financial records, I explained, noting how Derek's panic was reaching levels that suggested complete psychological breakdown. Agent Martinez mentioned that cooperation could result in reduced sentences, though the charges you're facing typically carry decades in prison regardless of plea arrangements. Derek stared at the federal evidence as if it represented his death sentence, clearly understanding that his charming entrepreneur persona couldn't overcome organized crime prosecution supported by comprehensive documentation and witness testimony. Elena, you have the power to influence how federal investigators pursue charges against me. If you requested reduced prosecution in exchange for restitution and acknowledgement of wrongdoing, Agent Martinez might be willing to consider alternatives to maximum penalties. The request revealed Derek's fundamental misunderstanding of federal prosecution procedures and my relationship with investigating authorities. I wasn't controlling federal charges. I was providing evidence that prosecutors had determined justified organized crime prosecution under statutes that mandated specific penalties regardless of victim preferences. Marcus examined Derek's desperate appeal with professional interest. Derek, federal prosecutors don't negotiate charges based on victim requests when they have evidence supporting organized crime statutes. Elena's cooperation provided evidence, but her influence over your sentencing is minimal compared to the testimony you might provide about other participants in this criminal enterprise. The role reversal extended beyond legal consequences into professional humiliation, as Derek's reputation in the industry was being systematically destroyed through federal investigation that revealed his systematic theft of intellectual property. Every business relationship he had cultivated, every professional achievement he had claimed, every innovation he had presented as his creative breakthrough was being exposed as criminal appropriation of someone else's work. Catherine Miles called to inform me that Denver Business Development is withdrawing their consideration of our expansion funding, pending resolution of federal charges, Derek said, reading through messages that chronicled his professional destruction in real time. She mentioned that investors can't be associated with entrepreneurs facing organized crime prosecution regardless of how charges ultimately resolve. I appreciated how efficiently the business community was distancing itself from Derek's criminal activities while maintaining relationships with me as the legitimate creator of the innovations he had been claiming. Catherine and I discussed my plans for expanding Thornton & Associates independently. She's particularly interested in supporting the person who actually created the strategies that made our previous partnership successful. Derek's expression shifted to something approaching horror as he processed the implications of his professional network transferring their loyalty and business relationships to me while severing all connections with him. Elena, you're actively courting our business contacts to support your independent venture, while I'm facing criminal prosecution. That level of professional opportunism makes you just as calculating as you claim I've been. Marcus's expression suggested he found Derek's moral equivalency arguments unconvincing, given the criminal nature of his intellectual property theft. Derek, Elena is building relationships with business contacts based on her legitimate innovations and professional expertise. You built relationships based on stolen intellectual property and systematic fraud. The difference seems obvious. The role reversal was generating consequences that extended far beyond criminal prosecution into complete social and professional ostracism, as Derek's former friends and colleagues recognized that association with federal prosecution targets could damage their own reputations and business interests. Rebecca Walsh from the Marketing Association sent formal notice that my membership is being suspended, pending investigation into presentation credential violations, Derek continued, documenting his systematic professional destruction through messages that arrived with devastating regularity. She mentioned that intellectual property theft by association members reflects poorly on the organization's commitment to ethical business practices. The humiliation was comprehensive and public as Derek's criminal activities became known throughout the professional networks where he had built his reputation on borrowed credibility. His systematic theft of my innovations was being exposed to every colleague who had ever praised his supposed entrepreneurial genius. There's something else you should understand, I said, noting how Derek's desperation was reaching levels that suggested he might attempt irrational decisions that would worsen his legal situation. Agent Martinez explained that federal prosecution timelines don't accommodate emotional appeals or relationship considerations. The charges you're facing will proceed according to established legal procedures regardless of personal circumstances. Derek stared at me with the expression of someone who was finally understanding that his systematic betrayal had produced consequences that no amount of charm or manipulation could overcome. The role reversal was complete. The woman he had planned to eliminate from their business partnership was now positioned to inherit everything he had obtained through criminal activity, while he faced federal prosecution that would determine whether he retained any freedom for the rest of his life. Derek, I said, meeting his devastated gaze directly, I think you're beginning to understand that the role reversal you're experiencing represents justice rather than revenge. The consequences you're facing are proportional to the scope of systematic betrayal you orchestrated while assuming that your charm and supposed cleverness would protect you from accountability. His silence confirmed what the role reversal had been designed to accomplish. The charming entrepreneur who had built his reputation on stolen innovations was discovering that systematic corporate crime carries consequences that transform perpetrators from successful businessmen into federal prosecution targets whose freedom depends entirely on the mercy of prosecutors who specialize in organized crime enforcement. 6 months after the anniversary dinner that destroyed Derek's criminal empire, I sat in the executive conference room of Thornton & Associates, reviewing expansion plans that would establish our digital marketing consultancy as the premier agency in the Rocky Mountain region. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek's systematic theft of my innovations had ultimately provided the foundation for success that exceeded anything we had achieved during our fraudulent partnership. The federal prosecution had concluded with Derek accepting a plea agreement that resulted in an 8-year prison sentence for organized corporate espionage, while Natasha Chen received 18 months in minimum security for her cooperation with investigators. Marcus Chen had emerged from the ordeal with his forensic accounting firm handling high-profile cases involving intellectual property theft, while I had built a business empire based on the innovations Derek had claimed as his own. The Morrison Industries contract expansion represents validation of everything we've accomplished, said James Mitchell, who had joined Thornton & Associates as Chief Operations Officer after providing crucial testimony during Derek's prosecution. They specifically requested our services because they wanted to work with the person who actually created the innovative strategies they had attributed to Hartwell Digital Solutions. The vindication extended beyond financial success into professional recognition that acknowledged my true contributions to digital marketing innovation. The Colorado Small Business Development Corporation had nominated me for Entrepreneur of the Year based on strategies I had developed while Derek was claiming credit during industry conferences, and 3 universities had requested guest lectures about ethical business practices and intellectual property protection. Marcus Chen had become both a trusted friend and valuable business partner, with our respective firms collaborating on cases involving corporate fraud and systematic intellectual property theft. Our shared experience of spousal betrayal had evolved into professional partnership that generated substantial revenue while protecting other potential victims from experiencing similar systematic exploitation. The federal task force investigation ultimately identified 47 victims across 12 states, Marcus explained during our monthly partnership review. Derek and Natasha's conviction provided the foundation for prosecuting the entire criminal network, resulting in asset recovery worth over $60 million for victims who had lost intellectual property through romantic deception schemes. The scope of Derek's criminal activities had been far more extensive than I had initially understood, involving coordination with multiple conspirators who used romantic relationships to mask systematic theft of innovations from talented entrepreneurs across various business sectors. His prosecution had dismantled an organized crime network that had been operating for nearly a decade. Catherine Miles had become the primary investor for Thornton & Associates expansion, providing capital support that enabled us to acquire smaller marketing firms throughout Colorado while maintaining the ethical standards that distinguished our operations from the criminal enterprises we had helped expose. Her investment specifically supported innovations that could be documented as originating with my expertise rather than borrowed credibility. Elena's case became a template for federal prosecutors handling intellectual property theft involving romantic deception, Catherine explained during a board meeting that reviewed our remarkable growth trajectory. The comprehensive documentation she maintained and the strategic approach she used to expose systematic fraud have been studied by law enforcement agencies across the country. The professional recognition extended beyond financial success into legislative impact, as Colorado had passed the Hartwell Act, which strengthened intellectual property protections for business partners and established criminal penalties for systematic theft through romantic deception. My testimony before the state legislature had provided crucial evidence for understanding how existing laws failed to protect victims of sophisticated corporate espionage schemes. 3 months earlier, I had testified before a congressional subcommittee examining corporate espionage threats to American innovation, describing how federal laws could be strengthened to protect entrepreneurs from systematic theft through personal relationships. The testimony had been cited in proposed federal legislation that would expand organized crime statutes to include intellectual property theft through romantic deception. The personal cost of Derek's betrayal ultimately produced benefits that extended far beyond individual justice, I reflected during a recent interview with Businessweek magazine about corporate crime prevention. The systematic documentation that seemed like excessive paranoia at the time became the foundation for protecting thousands of other entrepreneurs from experiencing similar exploitation. Derek's letters from federal prison had become increasingly desperate as he processed the magnitude of consequences his systematic betrayal had produced. His criminal conviction had resulted not only in his imprisonment, but in legislative changes that would prevent future victims from experiencing the systematic exploitation he had orchestrated with such calculated precision. The anniversary dinner at the Meridian had been transformed from a site of betrayal into a symbol of justice served and innovation protected. Marcus and I occasionally returned there for business meetings, appreciating the irony that Derek's planned humiliation of his wife had become the moment when federal prosecutors received everything needed to dismantle an organized crime network that had stolen innovations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sometimes I wonder if Derek understands that his systematic theft of my intellectual property ultimately provided the foundation for success that exceeded anything we might have achieved through legitimate partnership, I mused during a recent conversation with Agent Martinez, who had become a friend as well as a professional contact. Derek's case demonstrates that systematic corporate crime ultimately produces consequences that extend far beyond individual punishment into systemic protection for future victims. His conviction provided precedents that federal prosecutors use to pursue similar cases with confidence that organized crime statutes will be upheld by appellate courts. The vindication was complete and satisfying. Derek's attempt to steal my life's work through romantic deception had ultimately elevated my innovations into national recognition while establishing legal precedents that would protect other entrepreneurs from experiencing similar systematic betrayal. His criminal empire had been transformed into my legitimate success, while his freedom had been exchanged for federal conviction that would define the rest of his life. The anniversary dinner at the Meridian had been transformed from a site of betrayal into a symbol of justice served and innovation protected. Marcus and I occasionally returned there for business meetings, appreciating the irony that Derek's planned humiliation of his wife had become the moment when federal prosecutors received everything needed to dismantle an organized crime network that had stolen innovations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Sometimes I wonder if Derek understands that his systematic theft of my intellectual property ultimately provided the foundation for success that exceeded anything we might have achieved through legitimate partnership, I mused during a recent conversation with Agent Martinez, who had become a friend as well as a professional contact. Derek's case demonstrates that systematic corporate crime ultimately produces consequences that extend far beyond individual punishment into systemic protection for future victims. His conviction provided precedents that federal prosecutors use to pursue similar cases with confidence that organized crime statutes will be upheld by appellate courts. The vindication was complete and satisfying. Derek's attempt to steal my life's work through romantic deception had ultimately elevated my innovations into national recognition while establishing legal precedents that would protect other entrepreneurs from experiencing similar systematic betrayal. His criminal empire had been transformed into my legitimate success, while his freedom had been exchanged for federal conviction that would define the rest of his life.
Standing in my office overlooking downtown Denver, reviewing contracts that would expand Thornton & Associates into markets Derek had dreamed of entering through stolen innovations, I realized that his systematic betrayal had ultimately provided me with opportunities I might never have pursued if our partnership had remained based on trust rather than criminal exploitation. The woman who had signed federal cooperation agreements while her husband begged for mercy at an anniversary dinner had become an entrepreneur whose success was built on documented innovation rather than borrowed credibility, while Derek's charming persona had been permanently replaced by federal prisoner identification numbers that would define his identity for the next decade. Justice, it seemed, had been served with the same systematic precision that Derek had used to plan my elimination, except the consequences had fallen on the person who actually deserved them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.